Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. On a previous video I showed about half of the vintage PCs that I've been collecting in my cellar, and in today's video I want to show you the other half. If you haven't seen the previous video, check it out at the link above. But the basic story is I have to move for work from Kaiserslautern in Germany, where I've been living, to the UK, and I have to thin out my vintage PC collection a little. Some viewers had some suggestions about how to do this, and some even contacted me via email to suggest that they relieve me of some of the machines that I showed, and also some of the 486 boards and AGP video cards that I showed in the previous video. Now I have to prioritise people who are living locally because there's only a few weeks left and I don't have a huge amount of time to ship stuff out, although I will have to do some of that. But there were some other suggestions as well, from things worth thinking about through to the slightly less practical and some really quite hilarious ones that were very much illegal. But I do appreciate the humour, so thanks very much to everyone who commented. In today's video, I really want to document the remaining PCs and show them to you guys on the channel before they pass out of my hands, potentially. I actually have to go a little faster this week because unfortunately I've spent a lot of time already this weekend fiddling with my camera trying to figure out how to film CRTs better. And that's to film a demo that we recently entered in a demo competition here in Germany and won. And there are videos on the channel if you want to check out the demo itself and the audience reaction. So anyway, without further ado, let's take a look at some of these machines. The first machine is this beauty here, a compact Despro 386 25M. You might be thinking, but Will, why get rid of something like that? Well, originally I wanted a compact 386S, and those things are really rare, especially in good condition. And I missed a really great one because I totally underestimated how much those things go for. So I bought this instead, thinking that I would restore it. You can see that there's something missing here. Power supply doesn't work, and it's a bit grubby, so it would need a bit of work. But since then, I got really lucky and actually managed to acquire a compact 386S. So there's no motivation to finish this project off. It's really time for someone else to take this up. Well, the inside of this thing is a little bit of a mess, I have to say, and there's all sorts of stuff in here. So it looks like there is a faceplate. Maybe that's what's missing on the front there. I see that the power supply is just open. I don't see a cover for that anywhere, and the board is loose. It could just be that this thing needs the capacitors replaced or something like that. There's also a drive here, and perhaps that goes behind that faceplate. I'd say that would be the case, but maybe it doesn't work. And oh, actually look, here is the cover for the power supply. So it does seem that this thing is complete in some sense, but I would be very surprised if everything here is working. And I don't know whether this machine has been used as a donor machine, so there could even be bits missing. Well, I don't know about that hard drive. There's nothing in here. There's just a bracket, presumably for mounting a hard drive, and some screws. There's also this black plastic bracket. There's some cables, which look like they're for floppy and hard drives. A little plastic tray in there, and some additional screws. There's also this cable, which is obviously for getting power to floppy and hard drives. And interestingly, it says it's an EISA bus board. So these slots are extended ISA. Well, I'd love to show you this working, but as the power supply is apart, I assume that it doesn't work. And this slot here is labelled CPU, so I'm guessing that there's a CPU riser card missing here. This one's labelled expansion memory, and I don't know how much memory is available without that. This is labelled video, and there are 4 slots labelled EISA. Now, the extended ISA standard is 32 bits, but it does still accept ordinary 8 and 16-bit ISA cards. And the 5 chips are labelled compact, so I don't really have any clues as to what they do, but presumably just for peripherals and to control the slots. Either way, there's going to be a lot of work to get this going. You'd have to have another similar machine that you could pull parts out of to make a single machine out of the two. A few of the machines I'll show today are a bit cheeky. I don't even think they're 15 years old, so calling them vintage would be just a little bit of a stretch. I think I built this machine up myself. It's an LC power case, and I remember that I really liked the look of these. There's USB sockets on the front and audio, of course. I think this is just a pretty generic CDR. It says Super Write Master Speed Plus. And it looks like there's a real floppy drive in it, so it can't be that recent. But let's get the thing open and see what it is. Well, it's a bit hard to get everything in shot here, so let's start with the front of the machine. And I saw a number here, P4M900M2, which I thought would be the model number, but that's actually tucked in under here. It says MS7255 version 2.1, and it's an MSI mainboard with a VIA chipset. Now, evidently this is a PCIe graphics card, but obviously it's only got a fan, so it can't be anything terribly recent. And there's just SATA connectors here, although this is a mechanical SATA drive, not an SSD. Well, this is the front of the machine, and about all you can see here is a very large heatsink and fan. That might help you guess the vintage of this machine. And of course there's a couple of sticks of RAM as well. So let's power it on and see if it actually works, and then we'll be able to figure out what it is. Before I do that, one slightly concerning thing is this cable here, which looks like it goes up to those USB sockets on the front. And it's not clear at all whether that will actually plug into this mainboard. So whether the mainboard matches the case, I'm not sure at this point. Well, let's power the machine on and see whether it's actually working. I do hear the hard drive and CD-ROM making noises, but nothing is coming up on the screen. So I've got two choices here. I can either change the video card and see whether that's not working, or we're going to have to go back to the old-fashioned way of pulling the machine apart to see what's actually in it. Well, no luck with the graphics card, but I pulled the CPU fan off and it's just a Pentium 4, so there's no point doing anything more with this machine. It's worth about $1. In fact, the only nice thing about this machine really is the case. Basically, back in the day, I ran benchmarks on all my machines, and I always wanted to see what the next generation would do, and eventually, of course, got to the Pentium 4. But other than that, playing Half-Life perhaps, there isn't very much you could do with this machine that's of any interest at the moment, maybe in another 20 years. Now, the only reason to show any of the more modern machines I have is this monstrosity here, which an eagle-eyed viewer spotted in the previous video. And that's because it's absolutely huge. It's a Cooler Master, and I think an HAF, although that's not actually written on here. And it's difficult to do projects of this scale without something this large. It's so big, I'm filming it from halfway across my kitchen. And it used to have wheels on it, but they smashed when it was shipped to me. So it's actually really difficult to maneuver. Now, it's also quite filthy. It's going to require some work to clean out the filters on the front here, and there's a small scratch here that might need touching up. Now, I bought it for what's inside the machine, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but our viewer is interested in it for a home server project, so it's really nice to know that this might actually go towards something useful. Well, it's difficult to get everything in shot, but this mainboard actually looks lonely in such a huge case. It's a PPP67 Deluxe mainboard from Asus, obviously for overclocking. Now, it's just got a Geforce 1050 Ti graphics card in there, nothing special, but take a look at the massive heat sinks and fans on the CPU there. And there are two enormous fans in the top of the case, one on the back of the case, an even larger one on the front you can't see, and a huge one on the side, which I've removed. So this thing is serious about cooling things down, although it's not water cooled. Now, if I can find some RAM, we'll power this thing up and actually see it running. Well, I've powered it on to see if it works, and there's a lot of fans spinning, which you'd expect to make a lot of noise, but as you can hear, they're really quite quiet. Now, it does post, and it'll show it's a 2600K at 3.4 gigahertz, and the K really means that you can overclock this. Now, I'm not going to give away how far I've overclocked this, but this is why I purchased the machine. Now, it did eventually boot up to the desktop, but Windows really wasn't happy about the 4 gigs of RAM, and in addition to this, these motherboards tend to restart until they get the settings for the RAM correct, and they can actually do some automatic overclocking to some degree, although you'll get it a lot further if you actually work on it yourself and know what you're doing. And so that was a bit of fun for a while, and then I put it down in my cellar and forgot about it and went back to the vintage PCs. Well, the next machine is this one here, and it's got a 52 times CD-ROM, so this is a little bit more promising. This might actually qualify as vintage this time. There is unfortunately a little bit of a scratch across the top here, which I haven't seen before. But otherwise, this is a really nice white case with a black stripe down here. I really like the look of this. but I can't remember for the life of me what's actually inside it, so let's get it open and find out. Now this is one of those cases where you have to pull the front off to get the side off to get access. And other than that, the only other minor inconvenience is that the power supply sits over the mainboard, in particular over the CPU, which is maybe not the best configuration. Well, I remember what this machine is now. It's a Socket 370 Cellar, and you can see the chip down in there. And these are actually fairly hard to get these days, so it certainly is vintage and interesting enough. But the mainboard, unfortunately, is Medion, and this is a supermarket brand in Germany. And unfortunately, the AGP slot is damaged on the plastic at one end. So you have to push the AGP card up the other end of the slot to make sure it's making contact with the right pins, or it won't start up. There's a Sound Blaster Live card in here, but I don't think there's very much more I can say about this machine that I didn't already say in the video that I made on the channel about this machine. So I'll just refer you to that if you want to know a little bit more about this one. Well, here's another black LC power case, and it's not the same one. This has an LG DVD-ROM in it. And this is obviously also not quite going to be vintage, but it's getting pretty close now. So let's take a look at what's inside this. Well, it's a bit of a cable jumble inside, and I'm not really sure what this is. It's got a pretty massive heatsink here. The motherboard is an Asus P5 KPL/1600, which should be a fairly nice board. And it has a PCIe graphics card, although obviously nothing fancy. And I kind of feel like this is somewhere around the Core 2 Duo era, but I'm a little bit puzzled by this CPU cooler. So let's try and figure out what it is. Well, let's power this thing on and see if we can figure out what it is. There's red and blue lights in the front, by the way, which looks kind of interesting. Now, I'll just go into the setup here, and it says Pentium D. So this is actually a dual-core CPU at 2.8 GHz, but these were not very fast compared with the later Core 2 Duo CPUs, which were much nicer. Now, this is older and a little bit more vintage, but as far as the performance, it's really just not there. So that's probably the reason that this has ended up in my cellar. Once again, another very large case, and probably not vintage, but still not without interest, as I'll explain. This is an ST11 Silent Max, and it has a funny story attached to it. I actually bought it from someone who was obsessed with having a completely silent PC. So they had a Core 2 Duo in this, and it was just completely air-cooled without even a fan. And they had thick foam padding all the way around the case on the inside to prevent any sound coming out. Now, I've since changed this. This now has a Xeon in it. It's a multi-core machine. I think from memory it has something like 10 cores or something in that order. This is a DVD-ROM in the front, of course. So let's get the side off and take a look at the main board. As you can see, there's still some glue and foam when I rip that out, and it needs a little bit of cleaning up. This is a project that, again, I never really got around to completing. You can see the massive heat sinks on the Xeon CPUs here with the big fans on the sides of them, and these are both multi-core CPUs. These can be upgraded, and that's what I had intended to do at some point. And from memory, the RAM is not ECC at the moment, but it can take ECC RAM. But I'm not 100% sure on that. The video card is just a PCIe video card, and obviously not a particularly powerful one. But you know, if you have multi-core CPUs of this era, Windows of this era is not going to take advantage of that in games. And so I set this up with Linux and used this as a server. But I never really used it very much, and so eventually I got tired of it and put it back down in my cellar. And that's just unfortunately the case for a lot of the projects I've taken on over the years. Once I got really deeply into very early vintage PCs, these later ones just kind of fell by the wayside. Well, as you might have been able to guess, I bought this machine purely because it looks so awesome. I just love this case. But this machine is also a fairly recent one. The case is a Sharkoon, and it says it's powered by Asus. Well, we'll see if that's the case when we get it open. And I don't remember exactly what this is, but I know it is a fairly recent machine, so not exactly vintage again. But I promise we do have one more vintage machine to come after this. Now this case also has really large fans in it, and you can see it has a really massive GPU, but don't get too excited. This is just a Geforce 8800 Ultra, and this is not at all powerful by today's standards. There's a couple of hard drives in the bottom. They look like they're just loose though, and the CPU, we're going to have to turn it on to see what this is. Got to see if it powers on, and well, a blue light comes on the front, so something must be working. So let's see if this vulnerable old GPU can spring to life. Certainly taking its time, and I often find this with machines of this era. They just weren't built to last like the machines of 40 years ago. But after a bit of a think, it does seem to have started up. It says it has a 200 gigabyte Samsung hard drive, and well, maybe it's going to actually boot up. Well, according to the Windows About page, this is fairly recent. It's a Core i5, it looks like first generation i5 750 at 2.67 gigahertz. Now, it's fairly aged compared to a modern machine, but it's certainly nowhere near vintage. This is 8 gigs of memory, and it really doesn't run Windows 10 all that particularly well. But what it does run well, especially with that 8800 Ultra video card, is Need for Speed Hot Pursuit. And that's why I've had this game. It's a Steam game, and I spent many hours playing that game and really enjoying it. I actually liked the original Need for Speed game, which certainly is vintage by now, but this is a much later Need for Speed. So I don't think there's much more I can tell you about this. All I can really say is that I've personally lost interest in machines of this era, and if someone living nearby were to actually physically pick this up from me, I'd probably more or less give it away. Now, this final machine is a bit of a mystery. It's in really good condition, so I like that about it already. Looks like it has a very old compact disc player in it. And it says Intel inside Cellar, which has got me mystified because I thought I only had one Cellar machine. So I'm guessing that this is actually not a Cellar, and I've just left the label on. So let's get it open and see if we can figure it out. I've left this one to last because that's the one that intrigues me the most. Well, this is one of those cases where you have to take the top off to get the side off, but there's just one screw, so it's actually fairly convenient. And the main board's actually fairly interesting. It's a Gigabyte GA6BXC, and as you can see, it's slot 1 with a socket 370 riser. So this would take a socket 370 Celeron, for example. And the video card is just an AGP one. It's a Rage 128 Pro, so nothing particularly special there. And I did look up the CD-ROM. It's an XM6502B, which, believe it or not, is 40 times. That's hard to believe because those normally have, you know, a big 40X written on the front of them, and this has nothing. So this is not an old CD-ROM at all. So I guess this is just another one of those projects that I never got around to completing, but unlike most of the others, I don't even remember starting this one. So I guess that's sort of the case for all of the things in my cellar. All the other machines that I'm keeping, they all mean something to me and are really special, and I use them all the time. But the ones in my cellar, yeah, I could live without them, to be honest. Well, that's absolutely going to be it for this week, guys, and I hope you enjoyed looking at this collection of machines, which is a little bit newer than what I'd normally focus on the channel. It's almost like I organised my cellar with all the new ones on one side and all the older ones on another side. Anyway, as I said in the previous video, if you're a viewer and you live locally, don't hesitate to get in contact with me. I really don't have time to ship all these machines all over the place. I've only got a few weeks left before I have to go. And so I am looking for other solutions if possible. At any rate, that's it for this week. There's going to be some interruptions in the channel over the next coming months because of the big move that I have to do. For example, there'll be an entire month where I won't be able to make any videos because I'll be looking for accommodation. But don't worry, the channel is coming back, and it'll be a hobby channel. I have a definitive ruling on that now. It won't be possible for me to monetize, unfortunately, but I am looking forward to getting into some real vintage topics, especially programming related, and doing slightly longer and more in-depth videos on the channel in the future. So looking forward to that. That's it for this week. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you next time. Bye.